Forgive me if this sounds like it's all about the men. I'm not ignoring the women. It's absolutely true that both men and women have been used throughout the story of the Bible for God's purposes. But when I think of biblical men, particularly, there is great detail given to some of the patriarchs, the heroes, particularly of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Sadly, for the most part, we don't get as much of a detailed view of the lives of certain heroic women like Deborah or Ruth as we do of, for instance, Abraham or David. So you can think about this as men of faith or people of faith. It's your choice. But one thing is for certain, the biblical story is littered with stories of men of faith, of faith, people who have stood up, who have been heroes and have been used mightily by God in their time. But as I've studied this idea, the big ones that we all think of when it comes to men of faith, your Abrahams, your Noahs, your Moseses, one thing has become exceedingly clear to me, and that's of these heroes, none of them are without fault or flaw. Would that be fair to say? Yeah. In fact, the more that I have studied these men of faith, the more I have become familiar with the faults and flaws that these people indeed had. And aside from Jesus and maybe Daniel, in fact, as I was saying to Colin before, one of the only heroes in our Old Testament, in our Hebrew Bible, that is listed as, or at least does not have flaws or faults specifically named, is Daniel. He's one of the few people that you would read him and thought maybe he was a perfect guy. Now, certainly he wasn't. And Enoch, well, yes, of course, that's right. But the point is there are very few, right? There are very few. And when we talk about these men of faith, it seems to me that, that as much as they are known, revered for their achievements, their accomplishments, the things that God did through them, they are as much characterized by their faults and their flaws. I mean, after all, we don't have to look very far. Abraham is the father of the nation of Israel, but the writer of Genesis isn't shy about including the time he also sold his wife to an Egyptian pharaoh to avoid getting into trouble. David, a man after God's own heart, but also a man who had a guy killed because he fancied the man's wife, right? Moses, universally revered, especially by the Jewish faith, and is obviously well known for providing the law, the Torah, incredibly revered by not just us, but by the Jews, but also a deeply flawed man, losing his temper multiple times, eventually so badly that he is barred access from Canaan, the promised land. It's curious that the most revered men in the biblical story also happen to be the most flawed and broken at the same time. And the man that we're going to look at this morning, Noah, is no different. Noah is a biblical character as revered as he is the subject of scandal. So we're going to look sort of somewhat biographically at his story this morning, but the story of Noah does not begin with Noah. And because I'm a pastor, I can't help it. I have to bring in a little bit of Bible nerdiness. I have to bring in a little bit of the Old Testament Hebrew. So I promise that it will be as painless as possible. So before you start drifting off and start thinking about lunch, I promise you it's going to be worth your while. All right, so our story begins in Genesis chapter 5. It begins before Noah. And it begins with Noah's father, Lamech. Now, Lamech, when he had lived 182 years, Genesis 5, verse 28 and 29, had a son. He named him Noah and said, "He will comfort us in the labor and the painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed." Now, I think the key to understanding Noah's life is in also understanding Noah's name. Now, when I say this little line here, "He will comfort us," Does any other Bible translation that you have in front of you put it a different way? Just curious. The same shall comfort us. What translation you got, Jenna? King James, cool. Yeah. I am fishing for a particular translation without telling you what translation I'm fishing for. I know that we all read from different translations, but if you looked at an NASB, I believe, it would say, he will bring us rest. Right. So there's a bit of a two-sidedness as far as the biblical translation comes with this particular passage. I've chosen NIV because it's the most sort of mainstream Bible translation that we have today. But other translations, particularly ones that want to translate more literally, so whatever the Hebrew word meant, we want to literally translate it. They will say, he will bring us rest. So Noah's name comes from this Hebrew word, nuach, which means to rest. And you can see there's some of the little bits about it. I've taken this from Strong's Concordance. You can find this for free online. So if you want to double check any of these details, feel free to go to Strong's Concordance online. Noah's name comes from this Hebrew word which means to rest. Now there's some small academic discussion around where his name comes from. Some people believe it comes from a Babylonian word that kind of means the same thing. Some people believe that it comes from the other biblical name Nahum or Nahum, with the ending sort of dropped off. Be careful how you say that, otherwise you'll spit all over the place. Nahum, right? And the reason they believe perhaps maybe it comes from Nahum because Nahum means to comfort, right? So there's some similarity, there's some crossover here, but I wanted to give you that context, and that's why some Bible translations will translate it this way, to comfort us, because there's not a disagreement per se, but there's some nuance in how we discuss his name. So you can take it either way. Either Noah's name means to comfort or to bring rest. Bruce? Ooh, relief. I like that. Yeah. And so whatever the translation is saying and whatever words they use, Lamech, we can all agree that Lamech, when he names his son, he's injecting some expectation into this boy, right? He is kind of instilling a message, he's instilling a mission, a purpose into Noah right at the very beginning, right? No pressure, right? No pressure. But I think it's significant that we understand Noah's name because, as I said before, his name is connected to his purpose. And we only have to sort of understand the sort of world that Noah grows, that Noah is born into, to understand why this purpose was necessary. Fortunately for us, Genesis chapter 6, the chapter straight after, doesn't leave that much to the imagination. So Genesis chapter 6 and verse 5 says, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time." Verse 6, "The Lord then regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled." If we go into verse 11 and 12, so skip a little bit, it gives us some more context about what was actually going on in the world. "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways." And then we'll just stop there. Right. So this gives us a little bit of a clue, an indication of the reason that Noah is named what he is named, right? It gives us a bit of a picture of the world that Noah is born into. And it paints a pretty bleak picture. Can we agree? It's pretty bleak. But even on a surface reading of this, you can kind of understand the level of, let's say, depravity or corruption that the world has come under. But when we dig beneath the surface, not to be too dreary, it actually is far, far worse than even it appears on the surface. when you pay close attention to the clues that we are given, you begin to see the problem Noah is faced with is not just a fallen humanity, but also a corrupted planet. So I've got a few sort of abridged verses here, and please bear in mind that this is a selection. I've included the references if you want to read the full picture, but I've just abridged some of these verses to give you a concise understanding of what's happening here. So in Genesis 3, this is the very beginning, right? This is the curse is declared upon mankind in the Garden of Eden from God to Adam. This is what God specifically says to Adam. He says to Adam, cursed is the ground because of you, right? Because of the actions of Adam and Eve in the garden, there is a direct cause and effect. Because of what you have done, the ground is now cursed. I think this is tied in with the original sin, the picking of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because where does the tree come out of? It comes out of the ground, right? So there is a connection between your actions, what you have done, and the effect that it has on the things that you interacted with, this tree, and everything that's related to that. So the ground, it will produce thorns and thistles for you, and there's more in there that you can read as well. Moving on to Genesis chapter 4, directly afterward, you see the curse come into full effect in quite a gruesome way, right? Cain is jealous of his son Abel. He kills him. He murders him in cold blood. And then God's response to Cain is that your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground, which, by the way, becomes a very vivid and recurring picture for what happens when an innocent is wrongfully abused or killed, right? There's this idea that goes throughout the entire Bible of when somebody is abused, when a victim is taken advantage of, when a more powerful person uses their power to violently get their way, and it seems like the victim has no recourse for justice, God says, actually, when that happens, the earth itself cries out. But it's also quite gruesome, as you can see here. Now you, Cain, are under a curse and driven from the ground, again, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. Gruesome picture, right? This is probably a metaphor, but even if it is a metaphor, you can kind of imagine the ground opening up to receive, metaphorically, the blood of Abel. So something very twisted, very deeply wrong with this picture. And then finally, coming back to Lamech, the father of Noah himself, in Genesis, further on in Genesis chapter 4, Lamech said to his wives, he has 2 wives, which is probably never a good idea, but he says to his wives, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. And if you read the whole thing, it's not a declaration of guilt. It is not a remorseful statement. It's boastful. He's proud of it. He later on says, if somebody murders Cain, the Lord will repay him 7 times. But if somebody does something bad to me, may it be 70 times 7 or something like that, right? It's I am even more violent. I am even more vengeful. I am even more powerful than Cain ever was. So there's a lineage. There's sort of like I'm building on the legacy of the people that have come before me. And it's a legacy of violence. It's a legacy of death. It's a legacy of curse, right? And this is sort of a reflection of the world that Noah inhabits. There is something deeply wrong with human beings, but there's also something deeply wrong with the ground itself. The world is corrupt. If you think of any number of science fiction or fantasy films where you see the curse taken over, like I can't help but think of like the old Sleeping Beauty. When she's in this tower, these thorns grow up around the tower over time. It's sort of locked away, and when the prince comes in, he has to hack away at the thorns to be able to gain access to the princess so that he can save the day. There's something deeply wrong, not just with the people, but with the ground itself. In fact, if we look at the NASB, this was what I was fishing for. As Lamech comes along, he says, "This one will give us rest from the work, from the toil of our hands, arising from the ground which the Lord has cursed." And we could talk about the fact that God is actually involved in this curse. That's another uncomfortable sort of reality, but we don't necessarily have time to talk about that. So I hope that kind of paints a picture of the depravity, the corruption of what is going on in Noah's day. It's not a pretty picture. And so God responds in Genesis chapter 6. So if you have your Bibles, Genesis chapter 6, it is up on the screen. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 13. "So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth." And then if you go on to chapter 17, "I am going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish." Now, if we just pause right there, I think there is a significant side note possibly to explore a little bit. Because when I read this, or when I was taught this as a kid, it was very much a kid's way of understanding it. And I think to a certain degree, as I grew up, I didn't really have much of a framework for really understanding what is going on in this story. Because if we, just take this into account with our thinking brains, this is genocide. This is, God completely flicking a switch and wiping everything from the face of the planet. It's pretty serious business, right? And when you look at the research of why people struggle with faith, particularly Christianity, one of the biggest reasons why people struggle with faith is because of these stories of divine violence, divine justice, which often ends up in divine violence. This is one of the biggest blockers to faith in our world today. And this is one of the stories that people bring up as one of the reasons why we struggle as a 21st century society with the story of the Bible, is because of stories like this. God's response to human failure is often seen as over the top or unwarranted. And I hope that in our discussion earlier, I kind of illustrated why perhaps it couldn't be seen as over the top. But I think if we were to be really honest with ourselves, I think we would admit that at some point or another, this story, as well as some other stories of divine violence, has been somewhat troubling. The fact that God resorts to the ultimate act of violence to destroy the violence seems a little bit backward, perhaps. But I think that there is a deep sense of sadness, which is very true, but I also think there is a deep sense of love in what God is doing here. As we saw before, by Noah's time, there seems to be a corrupting influence that has embedded itself in a very real way into both humanity and the earth that humanity inhabits. To say it another way, what human beings are doing is unmaking God's good creation. We open up in the pages of Genesis 1 with a void and barren earth, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. And God creates order out of the chaos. He creates goodness out of the darkness. He creates life out of nothing, right? And he places these human beings in this world to take care of it, to steward it, to rule and reign alongside him in a way that will bring more creation, more life, more goodness. But what they do with it is the opposite of that. And it seems that throughout the combination of the curse, through a combination of their actions, what human beings are doing is slowly unmaking, undoing, destroying what God has created, which is incredibly, incredibly sad. And because they live so long, they are doing it over a very long period of time. Their influence, what they have done, unfolds over a long, long stretch of time. I've struggled with this story and other stories of divine violence in the Bible. And I think not that it really encapsulates it in the best way or the most concise way or the best, most compassionate way, but I think the best way that I have been able to come to terms with things like this is my upbringing as a kid living on a farm. My dad was a farmer. You know, he's farmed sheep and cattle, grain, all that sort of stuff. And I remember as a kid being very confused about why my dad would cull certain animals that I thought were fine. On the outside, they look fine. But my dad said, no, they're actually really sick and they are suffering. And I didn't really understand that as a kid. To me, it felt really unfair. It felt really sad. Well, they're walking around, they're doing whatever, they look fine to me, but they have to die. I really, really struggled with that. It wasn't sort of until I was a little bit older, I was about 12 or 13 years old at the time, and my dad was away somewhere, don't remember where he was, but we had a bunch of chickens. We had a chicken farm down the road, and when they got too old to lay eggs at an effective rate, they would give them to us, and we would just have them as pets. And one of these particular chickens was really, really old. She was an old hen, and she was really sick. And my dad was away at the time, as I said, and one day, my mum had got off the phone from my dad, and she was telling him about this chicken, and Dad said, well, you're probably just going to have to put it down. And my mum said, well, I don't want to do it. So, Jesse, you're the eldest child, your responsibility. I was like, seriously? I'd never killed another living thing, apart from ants and spiders and stuff before. I'd never even killed a snake before. Growing up in Australia, by the way. So, I was like, how do I do this? I don't know how, I'll spare you the details of how I killed this chicken. But it was the same way that you kill a snake, if you know anything about that. And it was a traumatizing experience for a 12, 13-year-old who had never done this sort of thing before. But it was through that experience that I realized, well, actually, sometimes the most loving thing that you can do is to bring an end to suffering, to not allow it to prolong, to not allow it to work itself out, to allow it to get to its eventual painful end. And I think that's what's happening in this story, is that what human beings are doing is slowly killing the earth and slowly killing them. And that because they live so long, and because they have all of this access to all these different tools, and they have access to God's good earth, the suffering and the slow death spiral is just that. It is a slow, slow process. And so what I have come to sort of think in my own sort of understanding of this passage is that what God is doing is he is giving a coup d'etat, a mercy kill to this world that is slowly dying anyway. But then, that begs the question, Jesse, why did you highlight this word? Because I think this idea of a flood is also significant. Does anybody know, why do you think the idea or the methodology of using a flood is significant in this passage? Any brave people want to give a stab at it?
Because it wipes everything away.
Yeah. So a flood it's purifying. Yeah. Any other ideas? That's a good point, right? Up until this point, we've had just sort of mists and stuff like that. Yeah. When we open the pages of Genesis chapter 1, we see a very vivid picture of what the world is like before creation. Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now, There is so much in that we could talk about. But I just want to bring our attention to two things. The first thing is this idea of the earth being formless and empty. Now, when you think of that idea, when you read formless and empty, what comes to mind? Nothingness, yeah. There's nothing there. Just emptiness, right? What do you think, if you could think of the most empty and void thing, what would it be? A black hole, yeah. Or like the deep, dark void of space where there's no stars and nothing, right? So we have this idea of when something is empty and formless, it's empty and formless. That's just sort of like whatever. But here's the thing. The people who wrote this particular piece of literature were not modern people. And it might surprise you, it's definitely surprised me, that in ancient Near Eastern culture, there is no idea, there is no word, there is no phrase to adequately represent what we would actually think of as nothingness. And that was surprising to me when I learned this. See, in a secular scientific explanation of the origins of the universe, if you're a secular scientist, you would be it would be very easy for you to kind of say, well, at one point there was nothing, and then suddenly there was a big cosmic explosion and everything sprung into being, right? That's sort of very easy for us to even wrap our heads around it, even if we agree with it or not, right? But for ancient people, there was always a very clearly defined pre-creation state that exists before creation. I'll say that again. If you're an ancient Near Eastern person, you would have understood that before creation, there was something. Something that was formless and empty, but something nonetheless. And that brings us to this idea of the deep. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Right? So that might give us some clues, right? In the case of Genesis, the thing that exists before creation is the deep waters. And this idea of deep waters preceding creation, it's a common idea across all the Near Eastern cultures of the time. The Egyptians had this idea that the original God, he rises out of the waters and then he creates stuff. In the Babylonian understanding, I've preached on this a few times, there was an idea that before there was creation, there was the chaos waters, the sea dragon, right? No matter who you were in this Near Eastern ancient context, no matter what culture you belong to, you would have understood that before creation there were just the deep waters. There was the dark waters. And today we know that planet Earth is composed of several geological layers. You have the crust, the mantle, the outer core, and the inner core. We know the Earth is a sphere, and at the middle is the core. That's just how planets are made. We understand that. But ancient people had no concept of this. Ancient people thought that the Earth was flat. There was a dome over the surface of the flat Earth. And we're not going to talk about flat Earth at all today. But that's what they thought. And they thought that beneath the surface of the land, where people live, where civilization happens, where we build stuff, where we plant vineyards, underneath that is just the dark waters. And they thought that if you could dig deep enough, you would just fall into the chaos waters, which is a kind of a terrifying thought if you can think about it. Dig, 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 and you just fall into these waters. It's crazy. Strange as that might sound to us, this is the way that people thought. And it makes sense within the context of the creation story, because the creation story is really a story about chaos and order. It's about God entering into a world that is formless, that is chaotic, and creating something ordered, creating something beautiful, creating something that has structure and light to it. And that's exactly what God does. Before there was life, before there was beauty or art or civilization or order, the chaos waters ruled supreme. So why is this significant to the story of Noah? Well, that's because these are the instruments that God uses to enact his mercy kill, his coup de grace. He is not merely using his cosmic powers to smite planet Earth. He is accelerating the process of decreation that was started by humanity by allowing the world to regress back to its pre-creation state. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day all the springs of the great deep burst forth and the floodgates of heaven were opened, right? But you may notice that I haven't talked a heck of a lot about Noah. That's because we have to talk about his purpose before we can talk about him. And this leads us to Noah himself, because this isn't the end of the story. I mean, if it was, we wouldn't all be here, right? Because God, in allowing the chaos to overtake the world, he does not do that simply so that all humanity might be smitten. He does it so that he can, through the family of Noah and Noah himself, bring about a new creation. Because remember, in the beginning, God doesn't just come down to a chaos-filled world and leave it chaos-filled. He brings new creation. He brings order out of said chaos. And he's doing exactly the same here. And that's exactly what happens. When the waters recede and a new day dawns upon the earth, God makes a covenant with Noah. And I think this is the real heart of the story. Genesis chapter 8, skip over to that. And I apologize for skipping over a lot of the story. There's only so much you can kind of cover in the time that we have. Genesis chapter 8, starting in verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, unprompted, by the way, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though," this is a familiar phrase, "every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. But I have," oh, no, we'll just stop there. Oh, spoilers. This is such an interesting little wrinkle in this story. God says to himself, and he says this later on to Noah, he reaffirms, these words, "Never again will I, smite the earth. Never again will I destroy the earth with a flood." Even though he admits to himself, things probably aren't going to change that much. Isn't that interesting? God says to himself, you know what? I am going to refrain from destroying the earth. Never again will I curse the ground, and never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done, even though what has happened before, in all likelihood, will happen again. And it seems that he holds true to this, because on a biological level, whatever curse the earth was under is now lifted. And this is illustrated later on in chapter 9 when Noah plants a vineyard for the first time, right? So this is such an interesting wrinkle here, because though Noah is the embodier, he is the representative, he is the person who steps out for all humanity to save all humanity, he and his sons and his family also become a living illustration for the fact that things don't really change for human beings, that we still make mistakes, that we're still selfish, that we are still slaves to our senses, and that in many cases we just end up finding out new ways to do terrible things to one another and to ourselves. Nevertheless, God chooses to bless Noah and his family and to make this binding covenant, not just with Noah and his family, but with all humanity, right? And of course, we can mention the fact in Genesis chapter 9, Noah builds a vineyard, he gets drunk, and then he gets nude, which I don't know how that happens, but I wasn't there. And then some dodgy stuff happens in a tent, and the last thing that we hear from Noah is a mixture, a cocktail of blessings and curses upon some sons and upon others. the last things that we hear from Noah is presumably after he's sobered up, but who knows, maybe he's still drunk when it happens, I don't know. He pronounces these blessings on two of his sons, the ones who covered him up, and curses the one who didn't. And it's a strange way to end the story of Noah, right? It's a strange way to end the story of Noah. So when I think of the story of Noah, as we're coming to an end here, to me, his story is a story of contradictions. In the beginning, Noah is described as a righteous, blameless man. And you may have wondered why I skipped over that. Genesis chapter 6, in verse 9. This is an account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God, right? That's how we're set up to believe who Noah is and the sort of character that he has. So that's how he's set up in the beginning, and yet his ending is a naked drunk dude, which is so bizarre. And it's kind of funny. It's kind of funny. Like, it's weird and funny in a strange way, right? This is the story. This is the picture that we have of Noah. He is, on the one hand, described as deeply righteous. On the other hand, illustrates how unrighteous he is in a certain setting. And yet, despite his flaws, Noah serves an important role in the story of humanity. As his father predicts, he ended up being a bringer of rest. Because through him, enmity between mankind, humankind, and the ground is ended. Through his faithfulness, God lifts the curse of the earth. Through him, the downward spiral of humanity was brought to rest. Through his endurance, much of the planet's animal life was preserved and given a second chance. And perhaps most importantly, through Noah, humanity itself is saved. Though it could be argued that things went south pretty quickly, Noah still stepped into the gap as a human representative to preserve and save the human race. He and his family navigated the chaos waters and emerged on the other side so that through him, humanity could be given a second chance. When I think about Noah, perhaps, maybe above anything else though, I recognize that the story of Noah does not stand alone. Noah serves not just as a representative for all humanity, but as a glimpse of the ultimate representative who is to come. Because when I think of Noah's story and I think of his purpose and what he comes to do, it's only a pale comparison. It's only an echo of the one that all humanity truly needs. When I think of the Old Testament story and going into the New Testament story, it became clear to me that Noah serves as a paradigm for all humanity, for the kind of leader that all humanity is waiting for. The righteous one who enters the waters of death and comes out the other side into new creation, and who brings about an eternal covenant of peace and life. That is what Noah does. He does that for all humanity, but there is also a wrinkle at the very end, because whilst he fulfills his purpose, he also fails right at the very end to fully encapsulate what humanity needs. A righteous representative who can not just lead humanity into a new life, but can actually help set up a kingdom of peace and love and justice. He gets so far, but he only gets so far. And so when I think about the type of person that Noah points us towards, I can't help but think of Jesus. Because Jesus talks about the same sorts of things that Noah talks about. In fact, in Luke chapter 12, Jesus says this, "I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I am under until it is completed." Now, this is just a small snippet from a greater discussion. But the interesting thing in this particular story is this statement comes after his baptism in the Jordan River. Jesus is talking about a different kind of baptism that he has to undergo. And it's confusing, and it doesn't make much sense. Because once you've been baptized once, why would you need to get baptized again, especially if you're Jesus? So as the story unfolds, it becomes more and more clear that Jesus is not just talking about a physical baptism. He's talking about something spiritual that he has to undergo that is like a baptism. It becomes clear that Jesus is actually talking about his death, and that he is thinking about his death and his resurrection in terms of a baptism. But Jesus' story ends a lot differently to the flood, right? In Genesis, the wicked die and the righteous one is spared. Noah and his family go into the ark, and through their faithfulness, they are saved, whilst the wicked people outside, the corrupt people outside, they die. But with Jesus, there's a contrast. Because when Jesus goes through the waters of baptism, he is the righteous one, and everybody else are the wicked ones. But the wicked ones in Jesus' story don't die. Jesus dies. Jesus is the righteous one who sinks beneath the waters of death, while the wicked ones live. In Genesis, Noah survived the flood by taking shelter in an ark, in a wooden ship. But in Jesus' life, his death and his resurrection, he becomes an ark of salvation. And not just for his family, not just for the people of Israel, but for the nations, for all humanity. When I think of the kind of man that Noah inspires me to be, I can't help but think of the man that Noah points to. More than anything else, Noah inspires me to look to Jesus, who represents a more concrete and a more final hope that one day all humanity will be able to experience ultimate and final rest. In closing, I'd like us to end on this particular passage of Scripture, a classic passage of Scripture which I think encapsulates Jesus' mission. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. My prayer for you and for me is that we would accept the yoke of Jesus, and that, like Noah and ultimately like Jesus, who we strive towards, that we would be people who bring rest wherever we are in whatever we do. Amen? Amen. Amen.